Good morning, and welcome to the second of a four-part series of virtual pulse meetings with PGRO and Syngenta. This morning we're going to hear from Dr Max Newbert on Bruchid, an update on Bruchid cast, and also Montecoto 1, one of Syngenta's insecticides. And then we're going to hear from Dr Becky Howard on some further information on pest management and IPM strategies. My name is Rebecca Stilton, and I'm one of the product managers for Syngenta, and I'll be hosting the meeting this morning and facilitating the Q&A session. Just a couple of housekeeping before we get going. So you may have noticed that we are recording this webinar, and this webinar will be shared on the Syngenta YouTube channel after the meeting, as well as the PGRO website. We would request that you don't record the meeting by any other means, because it will be readily available on those two media channels. We thoroughly encourage questions, and as I mentioned, I'll facilitate those as we go through the meeting. If you look to the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should see a Q&A button. If you type your questions in there, I will then ask the presenters to answer those. At the end of the meeting, you'll receive an email from the webinar, which will give you the option to apply for both basis and Roadshow points. We'll also include a link through to a survey, which we would ask you to complete to help us shape these meetings going forward. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Max, who's going to take us through Bruchid cast and Montecoto 1. Thanks, Max.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, and good morning all. So yes, I'm Max Newbert, the Technical Manager for Insecticides within Syngenta. So today, it's basically a few updates for yourselves, and then we'll go back to Becky Howard. So starting with one of the sort of things that's going to be happening this year, ourselves at Syngenta and PGRO have made a joint decision to stop the Bruchid cast service. Now, obviously this decision wasn't taken lightly, and really the decision was made because the whole reason for Bruchid cast was it to be a stewardship tool along with a decision making tool. The idea being that it would alert you when egg laying was going to occur so that you could plan your sprays accordingly. But what's been happening with the warming weather that we're having over the last few seasons, this system isn't providing what we want from it. As such, a lot of growers who are signed up to it are getting more or less weekly, if not daily, spray warnings, which wasn't really the design purpose of Bruchid cast. And to highlight the issues we're facing, I'm just in the chart you can see in front of yourselves. I'll just get my pointer. You can see 2019 and 2020 in the two rows with the sort of months over the sort of Bruchid period overlaid on top. And this is broken down into the days, and every time I've highlighted the days indicated in red, that would be when we're getting a Bruchid cast alert over the last two seasons. And I think from this you can see from ourselves it's not tenable as a stewardship tool going out from us with these spray alerts. As such, 2020 was the last year this was going to be a solution for growers. However, that being said, certain regions might still want to use this type of prediction tool. As such, you can see in the box below, and as Rebecca was saying at the start, these meetings were recorded, but if you want to note this down, this is basically the model for how Bruchid cast works. So if there's 2 days consecutively that have a maximum, so that's top temperature of 20 degrees or greater, this will then cause subsequent egg laying the following day. As such, you can do this with your own weather reports and then plan accordingly. The other thing to say is, with that in mind, the other change for the season is that thiacloprid is no longer in the market. So this time last year, we were at these roadshows doing recommendations of what you should have as your spray program. And as you can see here, what we have is sort of the period we would see as risk, when the flowering starts up, we bring the adult Bruchid beetles in, and then over this month period until end of flowering, you're really at risk with the pod formations. And we would have a system where you try and have knockdown before egg laying, and then Bruchid cast would be a good system of understanding when to attribute of thiacloprids and then hallmark applications. However, obviously that won't be the case this year because of the loss of thiacloprid for this season. So going forward, 2021, it's very much reliant on just contact insecticides, hallmark in the programme, and trying to get ahead of adult activity before eggs are laid, because the benefit of thiacloprid was that it did a good job at controlling the larvae as they were penetrating the pods, but without that systemic effect from thiacloprid in the system anymore, you'll need to make sure you're getting very good control of the adults before egg laying occurs to reduce that pressure. So going forward, this would be our recommended system for Bruchid control. So that was just my short piece on the state of Bruchid with the loss of Bruchid cast and the need to have a fully contact insecticide system, which means make sure they're timely application if they are made, understanding what your pressure is for your area and making those recommendations accordingly. Now moving into Montecoto 1, this is sort of just a reminder piece. So in 2020 we did some work on Montecoto 1, but this is the label we have for Montecoto 1. So for peas, it's edible, podded and vining peas. On label we have pea moth on the label, and you can have up to 2 applications of 0.185. Post-harvest interval 3 days and 7 days between applications. The main thing to note on this is the growth stage. So really we do not want applications to be during flowering, so post-flowering sprays only for Montecoto 1 in peas. Now, just to say there is more control than what's just on the label, and here's a chart of all the different actives which have wider activity than pyrethroids. In the left-hand column, this is Montecoto 1, and in the green is what I've highlighted as incidental control we've seen from trials and field use. So this isn't on label, but I've given them a bit of an efficacy indication what we're seeing with things like peach potato aphid, whitefly, etc., and you can see what level of efficacy. What's poignant for the pea growers is that you also do get pea aphid control with Montecoto 1, which is high levels of efficacy, and I'll show the work we did in previous years in the next slide. But just a note around Montecoto 1, it needs to be in the plant. It's a systemic product, and it itself being a WG formulation means that we need to aid that product getting into the plant. As such, a methylated rapeseed oil adjuvant is very good at aiding this. In brassicas, it's more or less an on-off system. If you don't include the adjuvant, you don't get this incident control of sucking pests. However, in peas, it's not quite the same. However, especially last year, we saw work where when it was very hot and the crops got very waxy, you got even better efficacy when using the oil. So it's really advised, but not necessarily necessary. And you can just see this from some work we've done previously. So you can see Montecoto 1 without an adjuvant, Montecoto 1 with an adjuvant, and this is pea aphid control at 3 days after application and 7 days after application, compared to Pyrimecarb, thiacloprid, and Hallmark Zeon. And you can see very comparable control to thiacloprid when using an oil, and far better persistency than when using a pyrethroid. So this was just a quick reminder of the added benefits you can get from Montecoto 1 in the pea crops. And that was my quick update. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll hand back to Rebecca Stilton.
That's great. Thanks, Max. There has been a question come in already, but I think I will hold this until the end because obviously we're covering the same topic throughout the presentation. So in that case, if we can hand over to Becky, who's going to take us further into pest management and IPM strategies.
Hi, yeah, I'm just going to share my screen now. Just give me 1 second. Okay, can you see that?
Yes, we can. Thanks, Becky.
Perfect. Okay. Thanks, Max and Rebecca, and morning, everybody. It's good to see so many of you here this morning. I want to follow up really from what Max has talked about this morning to talk about some of the different techniques that we use at PGRO. Firstly, really to help predict and monitor pest activity in legumes, and also then a little bit about some of the work that we're doing to develop alternative techniques to try and help manage them as well. So I'll start with our existing systems and also a little bit about the background if my slides will move on. Hopefully they will. Okay, good. Many of you will be quite familiar really with this integrated pest management pyramid that you can see in this first slide. It's what we use really to sort of form our decisions about crop protection and prevention of pest damage in crops before we get to the point of applying chemical pesticides. So at the bottom, we've got things like mechanical and physical means of managing and preventing pest incursions. And these might include, if we're talking about weeds, for instance, mechanical weeding, but physical barriers. So for some crops, that might include netting. And then sanitation. So this is really about farm and crop health. So it includes things like rotations, where you would keep a wide enough distance between legume crops to prevent some of the pests and diseases happening in the first place. And also when we look at the middle of that pyramid, we can see some of the other techniques that we can use. So there are biological control agents for some pests that can be used in crops, for instance, ladybirds to control aphids. We look closely at botanical and genetic diversity. So botanical diversity would include things like intercropping or trap cropping, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a few minutes. Genetic diversity, which can also include plant resistance, might include something like powdery mildew resistance in peas. And if you look at the bottom left-hand picture in that slide, you can see there's some good resistance in peas to some diseases. And we do measure, and Steve talked a little bit about this yesterday when he was talking about varieties. We do also record susceptibility to other diseases like rust and downy mildew as well. One of the things we focus on and have done for many years quite a lot is the insect and plant volatile side of things. And that includes many of our monitoring systems that we have and that exist currently for you to use, which will help really to make decisions when, and certainly as we move forward and we've got limited active substances that we can use, I think these become much more important. So the keys are really prevention, rotations, and then use of the tools that we've got available to us. One of the ones that we've had for many years really is monitoring and forecasting for pea and bean weevil. Now we know in recent years that pea and bean weevil resistance to pyrethroid insecticides has become more widespread. And as a result of that, we think this system should really be used by anybody that's growing beans and peas. You will probably know a fair bit about pea and bean weevil. It's an early pest in peas and beans. It usually starts to emerge from overwintering sites, which are the field margins and hedgerows of previous year's crops, in around sort of early to mid-February, as soon as temperatures start to warm up. The first signs of infestation are the notching that you see around the leaf edges. So you can see in those images there, you've got notching on beans and peas, which can look quite significant, but isn't really the main problem in legumes. The adults lay their eggs around the plants in the soil, and they get washed into the soil, and the larvae feed on the root nodules. And that's really the key thing that causes yield loss in peas and beans. And in conjunction with other factors that we have seen more often recently, I suppose, such as drought in the spring and summer, that can often cause more problems. However, if you use the trap system, this can give a really good indication of whether or not you need to spray. The trap system consists of 5 of these, what are modified boll weevil traps. And these are placed on the margins of the previous year's crops. If you haven't grown legumes before, then place them in the margins of your planned or existing crop at the beginning of February, and monitor them 3 times a week. The threshold for this pest in traps before you consider applications of insecticides is quite high. So it's an average of 30 weevils per trap on a single occasion. So that gives a good indication of whether or not you need to apply pyrethroid. And in some cases, I think you'll find that that's not always necessary. We've been working closely with Coppert over the last 6 to 12 months, really, to get this system more easily available to growers. It's not been the easiest system to get hold of over the last couple of years, but Coppert are now supplying this via their distributors. So it should be widely available as soon as possible now, ready to go into field margins at the end of this month and beginning of February. Another well-established system for peas is the pea moth monitoring and forecasting system. And this is a combination of a trap system and also a forecasting tool that we operate at PGRO. The pea moth is a later pest in peas. What we have found over the last few years is that pea moth emergence from soils, so it's overwinters in cocoons in soils, that emergence, because it's related to day degrees, has actually come forward quite a bit. So we would have said a few years ago that these traps need to go out in mid-May, ready to start catching moths at the end of May. Actually, we really need to bring that forward to the beginning of May. We started to catch moths as soon as we put them out this year, in 2020, in very high numbers. And we had a very extended period of moth activity in 2020. So put these traps out at the beginning of May. They're available from Coppet UK and Mat UK, and also a small company called Dragonfly. And again, monitor them 3 times a week. The pest lays its eggs on the foliage, and it takes between 10 and 20 days for the eggs to hatch and the larvae to crawl across the plant and invade the pots where they feed on the seed. And you can see the damage that's being done to seeds there in the picture at the top left, and also in the small clip there of our website. The threshold is 10 moths recorded on 2 consecutive occasions. You'll either receive the delta trap, which is the red trap at the bottom, or a castellation trap, which is your sort of traditional moth bucket trap, I suppose. And once you've recorded a threshold, that is not your spray date. What you're then waiting for is this period where the larvae have hatched and they're crawling across the plant. So we run a model all the way through the season from the beginning of May onwards, and we put predicted spray dates onto our website. You can also call us actually to ask us specifically for a spray date for your farm. And those are based on predicted day degrees and when the eggs are going to hatch, and hence when the larvae will be crawling across the pod. So a really useful tool actually for decision making in terms of whether you need to spray for pea moth and exactly when you need to do it to get the best effect. And I think that's really important, and all pea growers again should be using this system as well. There is a new monitoring system which actually at the moment doesn't have a threshold attached to it, and it's only really just become available. We've been using it for a couple of years to help with some research work that we've been doing at PGRO, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. And it's based on plant volatiles, whereas the 2 previous ones are based on insect pheromones. This is a plant volatile trap, and particularly for the vining pea growers and green bean growers, this can be a useful indication of when the peak period of activity of the adult flies is, and hence when that poses the greatest danger. So bean seed fly is a pest again, it's a later emerging pest. It usually starts to move into pea and bean crops in mid-April onwards, and the damage is caused to the imbibing seed and the very small seedlings by the larvae. So the eggs are laying their, the flies are laying their eggs on bare soil. They're very attracted to good, fine seed beds, bare soil. Historically, they've been associated with soils containing high levels of organic material, but in recent years, with the loss of products that might control these, we've started to see them occurring in high numbers on soils in many areas that don't contain high levels of organic material. So I think populations are increasing. So there is a system available to help monitor in field, but there's also a facility to report damage to crops, in any crop actually, because it has 40 or more crop hosts, including things like spinach and maize. On our PGRO app, you can record damage from this pest in any crop, and we are using that to try and help us determine where it first occurs, what the distribution of this pest is across the country, and how we can better manage it. And I will talk about some of the work that we're doing to help manage this pest as well. One of the other systems that I use a lot, and I think growers use a lot as well, is the AHDB aphid news. And this we work with AHDB, Rothamsted, Sasa and Ferrer to help produce the aphid news bulletins that are based on the suction trap network and also the yellow water trap network that Ferrer run as well. This is applicable to all crops, and what it does is it gives a really good early warning system for growers about what aphids are present and when they're likely to move into crops. So highly advise that you sign up to the email alerts so that you can see what's happening in crops. Usually we see, as soon as we start seeing our aphids coming up in the aphid news, it's only really a few days before we then start to see them coming into crops. And where we've got products that we can use for virus management, this is really very useful information. So when we come on to some of the work that we're doing to look at alternative techniques for managing pests, another of the sort of key pests that we see in field beans particularly and broad beans is the stem and bulb nematode. We've got two species of stem nematode in beans that we find. One is Dictylencus gigas, and this is by far the most common and the most damaging in beans. Dictylencus dipsaki, we do find it, not that commonly, and it doesn't do as much damage to beans, but it's really widespread in rotations and has a lot of hosts. So Dictylencus gigas is your focus in terms of bean damage, but Dictylencus dipsaki needs to be kept in mind across the rotation. So as you can see, the damage can be caused to the plants, and on the picture in the middle there, you can see, hopefully, it causes stem staining as it multiplies in the stem. It's seed and soil borne, so it moves from the soil or the seed into the plant, multiplies in the stem tissue, causing these galls and stem damage and ultimately yield loss. The other real issue, I suppose, with it is that it causes this seed quality effect as well in high numbers. So you can see black seeds in there. All of those black seeds in that sample that you can see in the middle are caused by stem nematode damage, and thousands of nematodes in each of those seeds could be present. It's really important, firstly, to test seed to make sure that it's clear of stem nematode, because every time you plant that seed, obviously you're going to return it to potentially clean soils. But we're also working with Harper Adams and co-funded by RAGT Seeds and Jordan Seeds with ourselves, a PhD at Harper Adams, to look at the potential for the use of biofumigant cover crops to reduce levels in soils. And preliminary results, we're still waiting for, so Nasamu, who is the student, is in the final stages of his PhD writing up at the moment. So we're sort of waiting for the sort of final confirmation of results. But there are strong indications that the isothiocyanates produced by particularly Indian mustard, which is Brassica juncea, can help to reduce levels in soils. There's also preliminary evidence that white mustard, which is Sinapis alba, is a host for the minor nematodes, so Dictylencus dipsaki, which doesn't affect beans so much, but can affect other crops. So that might be one to avoid. And laboratory experiments also showed that at quite low doses, the isothiocyanates produced can almost immobilize the nematodes. So they're not able to reach the tip of the root and move into the plant. So there's some promising results coming from this project, and we'll obviously keep people updated when we have final results from this. Coming back to bean seed fly, we've spent the last 2 years looking at farm scale sort of situation with this pest. As I said, it's a later pest, so often it's affecting vining peas, green beans, but some later drill combining peas might be affected by this as well. What we wanted to do was really have a look at, in a survey format, what were the key issues for growers really. So we worked with Swaythorpe growers and stem gold peas in Yorkshire and Lincolnshire, as they have quite significant problems with this pest. Because it affects establishment of the crop, there are occasions really in some years where you can see up to 50% crop loss, and re-establishing the crop after that isn't necessarily the best option really, because the pest is still present. So what we wanted to try and determine was what are the factors that are causing this to be more of a problem in certain areas. So alongside the use of the app where people can record activity, we've also looked at things like the period between cultivations and drilling, whether rolling's been carried out, how peak activity and the coincidence of drilling date interact with each other, and a number of other things like the type of drill that people use, for instance. From a survey, it's always a little bit tricky to get sort of definite trends coming out, but we did see a few things coming out. One is, of course, that when peak adult activity occurs close to drilling date, you get the highest levels of damage, and that's what you'd expect, really. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. One of the other sort of consistent things that came out of the survey was this period between cultivation and drilling. So from background literature reviews that we did with Warwick University, so Rosemary at Warwick, there was already an indication that that might help, but we weren't certain whether that was the case in the UK. So we looked at that, and you can see it, if you can see that figure at the bottom left-hand side, the longer the period between cultivations and drilling, the lower the level of damage we saw in the survey. So there's no statistics behind this, it's just a general trend that we can see. So what we did was we followed that up in 2020 with a small plot trial at our site in Stubton in Lincolnshire. And we looked at periods of approximately a week at a time between cultivation. So we started cultivating 28 days before drilling, and then 21, 13 and 7 days, and then also cultivated some of the plots on the same day that we drilled. And this was done in a small plot replicated trial so that we could analyse it statistically. From the 2020 trial, and there's a report available both on our website and AHDB's website because it's co-funded by AHDB, we could see some significant differences actually. So even at 7 days between cultivation and drilling in this trial, we could see that there was a significant reduction in the damage level from this pest. And the longer you left, the lower the levels of damage. The trial needs repeating. 2020, as you all know, was a peculiar year. So we went from being very wet to suddenly being very dry. And by its nature, because we're drilling sort of towards the end of April in this case, there were a few issues really around sort of drought and establishment and germination of seeds. So we'll repeat it in 2021, possibly again in 22, to just be certain that we can give this advice to growers to help them manage this pest more easily. And we'll continue to look at the other factors in the larger scale survey as well. Finally, just to come on to back to the subject of Bruchid, but also to include pea and bean weevil in this as well. We've started a project in 2021, so it started in January, to look at whether we could use trap cropping or companion cropping, I suppose is maybe another term for it, to help manage pea and bean weevil and Bruchid in peas and beans. One of the reasons that we've started to look at this more closely is that we know, and certainly from the literature, there are other potential hosts for Bruchid and weevil. So for Bruchid, it's reported that they are hosted by vetches, and for weevil by lucerne. So we want to have a look at that more closely to see whether we can trap weevils and Bruchids in legume mixtures, either in blocks or strips around the edge of the field, to see whether we can keep them in there, prevent them from moving into the crop. We've also got reasonably good data actually. So in 2015, we looked at, in small scale plots, at different sowing timings and how that impacted specifically on Bruchid damage. And we found that where plots are side by side in a small plot but replicated trial type design, that the earlier sown beans were much more susceptible to Bruchid damage than the later sown beans. And we had a period really from the beginning of March to the middle of April that we were looking at in terms of timings. And the later sown ones certainly had less damage. Now it could be that there's a natural inclination for Bruchids to be less damaging to the later sown ones, but there could also be the impact of those crops in close proximity to each other at different crop growth stages that is causing the Bruchids to move into the earlier ones, lay all their eggs, and not actually move into the later sown ones in such great numbers. We took this to a field scale in 2019, and although the results are sort of quite small in terms of the benefit, what you can see from that figure on the left there is you've got the experimental field where we've got an early sown block of spring beans sown on the 29th of January. We've then got the later sown main crop sown on the 25th of February, and then we have a control field within a half a mile of the same experimental field, which was sown at the same time as the main crop in the experimental field. So we've got this early indication that there's really a very big difference between the trap area and the main crop, but also that there's a small difference between the control field, which did not have a trap crop in it. So although it's only approximately 5%, that is still 5%. So we're then sort of including that really in our project that's running now for 3 years, starting in January 2021, to look at the use of legume mixtures, but also at one of the sites, hopefully, if we can get it in the ground, to look at the use of an earlier sown bean trap as well. And this is co-funded with an organisation called the Ekhaga Foundation in Sweden. The other thing that we will include within this experimental work is the use of the pheromones, the insect pheromones and the plant volatiles that we already have for weevil and bruchid. So we will put traps and lures into the trap crop in the hope that we can keep the pests in the trap crop and keep them out of the main crop more effectively. So not only we've got the effect of the legumes in the mixtures, but we've also got the effect of the attractants and in that also in those blocks. So we'll continue this work for 3 years. Hopefully by the end of this first year in 2021, we'll have a really good indication of whether this might be something that can help growers, particularly those that don't want to use insecticides at all. So really exciting project, and really pleased to have got that funding to help us do that work. So that's everything I've got to talk about this morning. Thanks for listening. It's good again to see so many of you here. If you want to ask questions, please do. And I've also put here my contact details and the contact details for PGRO. Plus, again, a reminder that I think Steve mentioned this yesterday. If anybody is interested in being part of the Yield Enhancement Network for either peas or beans, they can contact us or contact ADAS, and here's the contact details for ADAS. So thanks again, and I'll pass back to Rebecca, and I will try and stop sharing my screen.
That's great, thanks Becky. We've got quite a few questions in, so we'll try and get through these as quickly as we can. To start with the first one, would copper or sulphur help to overcome some of these pests?
I think sulphur, from our point of view, for our crops, really is useful for disease control, actually. So for powdery mildew in particular, copper, well, I'd say perhaps copper's perhaps best used in the sense of snails and slugs, but I don't know that it has. I don't know, Max, whether you know if it's got any effect on other pests. I don't really know of any.
With what we've discussed today, I don't think it would have any efficacy that would be beneficial.
No.
Lovely, thank you guys. Next one, do we know of any pyrethroid resistance in pea moth?
Well, from any resistance group monitoring that I'm involved in, there's not been any detected so far, from what I know, unless Becky's got any information I haven't been aware of.
No, not that I'm aware of, not at the moment.
So it should still be fully susceptible as far as we're aware.
Good to know. So now thiacloprid has been withdrawn, current resistance and variable levels, is it worth treating Bruchid?
It's, I'll let you go first, Becky.
I think in some areas the answer is really, the honest answer is probably not. It's certainly when we look at Andy Berry yesterday showed the maps of Bruchid across the UK now, and you can see in the south and southeast in particular, and across sort of large parts of southern England, we're seeing very high levels. The biggest, so pyrethroid resistance, of course, is an issue potentially, and actual control using pyrethroids is an issue. The other issue is temperatures, and Max touched on it earlier. We are seeing regularly high temperatures in late May and June, and this is the biggest influencing factor. So whilst we go forward and we know that we're seeing temperature warming during that period, and particularly during the crop growth cycle, then for some areas, no, definitely, I think the answer is no.
Yeah, I completely agree with Becky. This is why in my piece I did say you have to be completely aware of your local situation. If you're in the south with warm temperatures, the pressure is going to be so prolonged and difficult. And we do know from Steve Foster's work at Rothamsted there is some form of metabolic resistance in the population, which isn't necessarily a surprise since they've been exposed to pyrethroids for a prolonged period of time. It's a difficult one for those high pressure areas, especially when you have to take into account you need a relatively good yield to get the premium to pay for the applications on top of everything else. So there's a lot of factors that you have to bring into it. So I think for the south of England, it's getting more difficult to be recommending it as a blanket recommendation.
Yeah, and I think as well, I think that people need to take into consideration the financial viability of trying to achieve the human consumption grade as well, with the limited armoury that you've got now. So it's tricky. Is Montecoto 1 being approved for other crops? Do you want to take that, Max, or shall I?
Is it being approved or is it approved?
Is Montecoto 1 being approved for other crops?
Well, currently Montecoto 1 on label has the peas, which we went through today. It's got some alliums on there, bulb onion, salad onion, garlic, and then a lot of brassicas and umbellifers like carrot and parsnip. Expansion out of that, we are exploring looking at getting Montecoto into other crops, but that's not in the short term currently. So that's going to be 3 years plus anything that we're looking at. And will be very specific markets as well. So we are looking into it, obviously with a new insecticide, but it's not in the short term. So as time goes on, we'll report more in the future.
Can you remind us what the active is in Montecoto 1, please, as I didn't see it on the screen? So that's cyantraniliprole is the answer to that one.
And just to say, that means it's a diamide AI. So for peas, outside of pyrethroids, it's a good different mode of action.
Next, the pea and bean weevil management in regards to field beans, would it be beneficial to mow them to reduce pressure? Would it help to mow field margins to reduce pea and bean weevil pressure?
No, I don't think so. Particularly, populations are very high. They're likely, I suppose, to be in the sort of tussocky grass margins, but I think you've also got to keep in mind you beneficial insects and suitable habitats for those as well. So no, I don't think it would make very much difference, to be honest.
From the work we've done, whenever we've had a semi-destruction or removal of headland mixes or grassland, it's a minimal effect generally on the number of insects. So it's going to have just a mow is going to likely have very minimal effect on the total population inside there.
Moving on to pea moth, what would be the day degree accumulation for pea moth adult sightings, e.g. egg larvae?
Oh, I can't remember off the top of my head, to be honest, but I can certainly get that information.
We'll make a note of who's asked that and get back to them.
Yeah, no, it's published, so I can get that information to you, definitely.
Okay, back to bean seed fly. Can you record bean seed fly on the PGRO app even when you aren't at the location that you found it?
Yes, you can. You can put in a report at the end of the day, for instance, and put in a postcode location, for instance, of where you were. So yes, absolutely, please do.
And sticking to bean seed fly, why is cultivation interval reducing bean seed fly damage? Do we know?
I think part of it is that they are very attracted to fine seed beds. I think it's possibly related to the influence of how easy it is for them to penetrate into the ground and and down to the seed. So I think that A, they're more attracted to fine seed beds, and B, it may prevent some movement of the larvae.
And sticking with bean seed fly, so would that mean that ploughing in November and drilling in the spring would potentially lower the risk?
Yeah, that's what we're seeing, I think, generally, is from both the survey and the small plot trial. I think that's coming out as a reasonably good trend now. So.
And just thinking on from that, so would drilling directly straight into a desiccated cover likely increase or decrease the bean seed fly incidence?
I think direct drilling is, there's a lot of reports that it does reduce damage actually. but I think that needs a bit more. We need to do a bit more work on that, because we've only had a couple of sites where that's been the case. So I wouldn't like to really give to it. In theory, yes, I think it should reduce damage, but I prefer to see it for myself a bit more clearly than just make that recommendation. But hopefully it would do, yeah.
Moving on to pea and bean weevil, do you have any indication of the level of pyrethroid resistance in pea and bean weevil?
We've not looked at it in the last couple of years. It was reasonably widespread, I think, wasn't it, Max, when we last looked at it?
So this is something that our two organisations are hopefully going to be working on in the future. But the last time we were looking at it as a company as Syngenta was, I think, 2015, 2016. And it's a KDR type pyrethroid resistance for the resistance we were detecting in pea and bean weevil. And I think it was, back then, it was relatively widespread. I think the majority of locations had some form of resistance, but at that time, the population was still wholly, depending on which area you're in, the east was much more pyrethroid resistant. There were still susceptible populations. However, that is 5+ years ago now. So more work needs to be done to give an actual answer, because of population dynamics changing so much in that time.
Do we have any indications of how far weevils can travel?
They can fly. They're not easy flyers, though, to be honest. They're a little bit lazy when it comes to flying, I think. They tend to walk into the crop first. But populations are very widespread now, really, across the whole of the southern part of England, certainly. We see the same pattern, I suppose, as we do a little bit with Bruchid, in that they're not as frequent or common further north, but certainly in the main arable growing regions, they are very common. So, they can travel far enough to get to a field of beans, certainly.
Just back to Montecoto quickly, Max. Can you clarify what the mode of action, please, and how systemic it is?
So it's xylem systemic. As I was saying, as long as it's in the plant, oils generally help get it into the plant. Once it's xylem systemic, it will be taken up into either the chewing pest or sucking pest. And diamides work on interactions with calcium deposits in mussels. So it's a muscle active type insecticide, and it's got very good systemicity.
Thank you. But has any work been done on alternative sprays such as garlic on Bruchid or weevil, as has been done on flea beetle in oilseed rape?
We have looked at some alternatives in the past. I'm not sure that garlic's. I don't think we've looked at it for Bruchid, but we do look at alternatives. Obviously, we've looked at some of your alternatives as well as other people's. So I think some of those products are not as effective, perhaps, but we continue to do the same anyway. We slot things into our levy work, and we obviously work with under contract to companies to do work on their products. So we keep looking.
There was another question as well on a similar vein of has any work been done with orange oil on aphids in peas and beans that we know of?
I don't think we've looked at it, but I will check. Actually, I don't think we have.
We haven't done it from our side.
No.
No. So back to Bruchid quickly. If we're virtually accepting of not controlling Bruchid in the field, then should we be looking at improving methods of eradication and control of them in stored product?
That can help, certainly. What generally happens, though, is that by the time that you harvest beans dry, the adults will have moved into overwintering sites. It depends a bit on when harvesting happens, and obviously some years it can be earlier than others, but on the whole, most of them are intending to get back to their overwintering sites. So storage by fumigation can help, storage fumigation can help. It's unlikely to be as successful if the Bruchids are still inside the beans.
I mean, oh, sorry, Becky.
No, carry on, Max, it's fine.
I would just say you're always going to have also wild hosts, and as Becky was saying, escapees before harvest. So as a control measure overall, I think it might help in the long term, but I don't think it'll be effective enough to reduce pressure for the country to what we would expect to be, human consumption. I think the work Becky's doing, looking at trap cropping or promoting the beneficials or attractors, I think that's got more legs for reducing damage to get to a premium than controlling the population for eradication after infection or larval infestation.
Okay, last few questions. Sorry, were you about to say something, Becky?
No, I mean, just to back up what Max has said, I think the other thing that we know, although itself it causes a little bit of damage to beans, but significantly less damage than bruchids perhaps, is there is a natural pest of bruchids as well, which is a parasitic wasp. So I think the use of these sort of strips and trap crops can, if it can encourage more of those, then it will reduce bruchid damage hopefully a bit, but it has its own damage. It obviously goes into the seed to feed on the larvae, but nonetheless, there are things I think that we need to continue to look at.
Right, so let's try and rattle through these. So pea moth, when do you normally spray vining peas for pea moth? Why would the timing be different?
So for vining peas, the threshold for damage is less, actually. I think that's the key thing, really. So fresh crops are, there's a very almost zero tolerance in terms of its sort of quality going into the factory. So for pea moth, for vining peas, we use the traps as an indicator of presence, and the threshold is lower. You still calculate your spray date in the same way. So we know that the eggs are hatching, they're taking between 10 and 20 days to hatch, and that the larvae will be crawling across the plants then. You just pull back on your threshold. So the traps are used in vining peas, but as an indicator of presence. So that's the important difference.
Okay, do we know, are breeders doing any work on incorporating resistance / tolerance of any of the common pests in peas and beans?
There is some work going on for bruchid, certainly. I think in most, not in this country necessarily, but the French have been looking closely at that again, I think. But it's not been a very easy process, to be honest, with bruchid resistance, certainly.
Do we know what the main predators of pea and bean weevil are?
It has, birds would be one. It is quite susceptible to a fungal pathogen, which is Bavaria bassiana, which is naturally occurring, and it was isolated from cytona pea and bean weevils when it was first sort of realised that Bavaria bassiana could give some potential control. But there are no insect predators, I don't think, not to my knowledge anyway.
Okay, and I think it's probably the last question that we've probably got time for, which is for Max. So does, I'll try and combine two questions here. Does Montecoto 1 have any effect on bruchids systemically? And do we think it would have any useful effect for cabbage stem flea beetle?
So for Montecoto, it will have effect on bruchid beetle. We have seen efficacy on it. However, it's not registered in the relevant crops really for field beans, etc. So the other thing with that, it's a hard thing to recommend because we as Syngenta don't want to recommend Montecoto at times of flowering, and for bruchid beetle in things like field beans, they can be flowering right through that risk period. So for that reason, we wouldn't be recommending it. And we did do trials seeing if you could spray before or after to help, but you don't get the efficacy there. And it works well because it would be working a bit like how the thiocloprid work, because it's systemic, it's affecting the larvae as they penetrate, which is also for why things for like peas, it might be a benefit over pyrethroids, because as the caterpillar chews, it will be controlled. For cabbage and flea beetle, we've seen in brassica crops, especially I think it was in 2019 autumn, where we had very high pressure coming from the oilseed rape crops going into the sort of Brussels sprout crops. We were getting useful reductions in damage on the buttons from the adults. So we've done work on it, and it does have some efficacy. So yes, that's potentially one of the things we'll look into in the future, but that is a while off yet.
Brilliant, that's great. I think we'll pretty much used up all the questions there. So the last thing to do is just say thank you to everyone for joining us. Thank you to Becky and Max for your presentations. We hope that you enjoyed the webinars. As mentioned, this is the second in a 4-part series. So tomorrow we'll be hearing about disease control from Leah Howard and Michael Tate. So if you please join us. You'll receive an email after the webinar closes where you can claim your basis and Roadshow points if that's applicable, and also a link to a survey, which we'd love to hear your views on this event and how we can shape those going forwards. So thank you very much, everybody. Hope you enjoy the rest of your day and hope to see you tomorrow.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.